My name is Diane Marlene Pruitt. I am 52 years old. I'm going to tell you about an estate auction held on a gravel lot off Camp Creek Road in Greene County, Tennessee, on a Saturday morning in April, where 211 people stood in the cold drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, waiting to bid on the contents of my father's house. My brother organized that auction. He printed the flyers himself, bright yellow, stapled to telephone poles from Greenville to Bayleton. Estate sale, everything must go, they said, cash or check. No exceptions. Lot 114 was a cedar chest. It came up around 11:15. The auctioneer had it pulled up on a folding table, lid open, and he was already halfway through his chant, "What am I bid, what am I bid, somebody start me at 20, when I raised my hand. Not to bid. It to stop him. I had a manila folder under my arm. Inside it was a piece of paper my father had signed 4 years earlier in front of a notary in the kitchen of that same house. And a stack of receipts, 81 of them, that I had been keeping in a shoebox since 2018. My brother was standing about 15 feet away, in a green canvas jacket, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee that didn't move for a long moment. He didn't know I had kept anything. That was the whole problem, really, when I think back on it. He never thought I was the kind of person who kept things. Before I take you there, if stories like this one matter to you, please like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read everyone. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning explains the cedar chest, and the cedar chest explains everything else. I grew up on that property. 41 acres off Camp Creek Road, about 11 miles outside Greenville, in the part of Greene County where the hills start to fold up into the Bald Mountains and the cell service drops out if it's raining. My father, Harlan Pruitt, ran a hardware store on Main Street for 36 years. Pruitt's Hardware and Feed, the kind of place with creaky wood floors and a cat that lived in the seed bins. My mother, Carol, kept the books for the store and ran the house, and between the two of them we were never rich, but we were never short either. My father used to say, "We don't owe anybody anything, and that's worth more than money." He said it so often it stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like weather. I was the younger of two. My brother Roy is 3 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, Roy was the one things were planned around. Not because anyone said it out loud. Nobody in my family ever said Roy is more important. It was quieter than that. It was the seat at the head of the table that stayed empty until Roy got home from baseball practice. It was the new truck for his 16th birthday, used, but new to him, a 1991 Ford Ranger my father had detailed himself the night before, while I got my mother's old Buick 2 years later, the one with the AM radio that only picked up a gospel station out of Johnson City. It was small things, 100 small things. None of them on their own would mean anything to a stranger. But I noticed them. I noticed them the way you notice a clock that runs 4 minutes slow, not enough to be late, just enough to never quite be on time, year after year, until you stop trusting the clock altogether. Roy went to East Tennessee State for 2 years and didn't finish. He came back to Greenville, worked at the hardware store on and off, sold cars for a stretch at a lot in Morristown, and eventually settled into doing odd construction work, decks, fences, the occasional roof. He married young, divorced at 31, and moved into a single-wide on a piece of land my father let him use, about a half-mile down the road from the home place. Free of charge. No lease, nothing in writing. I went a different direction. I got a scholarship to Walters State Community College, transferred to the University of Tennessee, and got a degree in business administration. I started working as a claims adjuster for an insurance company straight out of school, first auto claims, then property, and I've been doing it for 26 years now. I live in Morristown, about 25 minutes from the home place, with my husband Tom and our 2 kids, who are grown now. People think claims adjusting is a desk job. It isn't, not really. You go to houses after fires, after storms, after a tree comes through a roof in the middle of the night. And the thing they teach you on day 1, the thing that becomes instinct after 26 years, is this. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Photograph everything. Date everything. Keep the receipt. Keep the canceled check. Keep the email even after the conversation is over, because 6 months from now, somebody is going to have a different memory of what was said, and the only thing that settles it is the paper. I didn't know, when I started that job at 26 years old, that I was building the exact set of habits that would matter most 26 years later. Not for a claim, for my own family. My mother died in 2012. A stroke, fast, in the kitchen of the home place with my father standing right there. He was 71. After that, he lived alone on Camp Creek Road for 6 years, and for those 6 years, he did fine. He kept the garden going. He drove himself to church on Sundays. He still went into the hardware store 3 mornings a week, even after he sold it, just to sit in the back and drink coffee with the new owner. Then, in the spring of 2018, he had a fall. Broke his hip. And after the surgery, the doctor told us something that changes everything in a family, whether the family is ready to hear it or not. He said, "Mr. Pruitt can go home, but he can't be alone." That sentence landed on me, not on Roy, on me. I want to be precise about how that happened, because it didn't happen with a conversation. There was no family meeting where we sat down and divided up responsibilities. What happened was this. I was the one who answered the phone when the hospital called about discharge planning. I was the one who drove to Greenville that afternoon because Roy didn't pick up. I was the one who said, in a hallway outside my father's hospital room, "I can come by every day after work and on weekends." Because somebody had to say something, and Roy was outside smoking, and the hospital social worker was waiting with a clipboard. That sentence, "I can come by every day," turned into 6 years. 6 years, 2,219 days, to be exact, because I counted the way I count everything. For the first 18 months, I drove out to Camp Creek Road 5 evenings a week after work, plus Saturday and Sunday mornings. I made his meals, managed his medications, 11 different prescriptions by the end, all in a weekly organizer I refilled every Sunday, drove him to physical therapy in Greenville twice a week, and handled his bills because his eyesight had started to go and he couldn't read the small print on the statements anymore. Roy lived a half-mile away. In those 18 months, he came by what I'd estimate, and I did estimate because at a certain point I started writing it down 11 times. Usually to borrow something. A chainsaw, $40 for gas. Once, my father's truck for 3 days to haul a deck job's lumber, and it came back with an empty tank and a crack in the windshield nobody ever mentioned. I'm not telling you this to make Roy sound like a monster. He wasn't cruel to our father. He just wasn't there. And there's a particular kind of absence that's worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least requires you to notice the person you're being cruel to. In year 3, my father's health declined further. Early-stage dementia on top of the mobility issues from the hip. The doctor recommended either a memory care facility, which my father refused outright, the one time we brought it up, with more force than I'd seen from him in years, or round-the-clock care at home, which Medicare doesn't pay for, not really, not the kind he needed. So I scaled back my hours at work. I went from full-time to 4 days a week, which meant a real cut in income, about $11,000 a year for 3 years before I went back full-time. And I started spending money out of pocket. Not loans. Not anything anyone was going to pay me back for, because at the time, nobody was thinking about being paid back. You were thinking about your father, who was scared, and who was, more and more, becoming someone who needed you the way a child needs you. A hospital bed for the downstairs den so he wouldn't have to manage stairs. $1,800. A backup generator because the power went out twice that first winter and his oxygen concentrator needed it. $2,200 installed. A chest freezer so I could batch cook on weekends and leave 2 weeks of meals at a time, because some weeks I couldn't get out there every single day. $610. A used Kubota tractor with a brush hog attachment, because the lawn service he'd always used quit answering calls, and the property was 41 acres, and if the fields weren't kept down, the county would eventually cite him for it. $4,800. Grab bars, a wheelchair ramp built by a contractor I found and paid because Roy, who does construction for a living, was, quote, too busy that month. $1,400 for the ramp. Medications not covered by his supplemental insurance. Gas, 480 miles a month, round trip for 6 years. Adult incontinence supplies, because by year 5 he needed them, and that's not a sentence I ever thought I'd say about my father, and it's not a sentence I'm going to dress up for you. That's what caregiving is. Nobody tells you that part. By the time my father died, in March of last year, I had spent $23,400 of my own money on his care, on top of 6 years of my time. I know the number because I have every receipt. I have them because I'm a claims adjuster, and because somewhere around year 2, almost without deciding to, I started a folder. Not for a lawsuit, not for an inheritance, just because that's what my hands do. That's what 26 years does to your hands. My father knew about the folder. I never made a secret of it. I'd mention it sometimes, half joking. Well, that's going in the file, Daddy. And he'd laugh and say, Diane, you'd keep a receipt for the air you breathe. He was right, I would. I want to tell you about one person, because she matters to everything that comes after. Her name was Eunice Tallant. She was 78 years old, lived alone in a little white frame house directly across Camp Creek Road from my father's place, and she had been his neighbor for over 40 years. Eunice didn't have much. Her husband had passed in the 90s, and she got by on Social Security and a small pension from the school cafeteria where she'd worked for 3 decades. But during those 6 years, on the evenings I couldn't make it out, when my own kids had something at school, or Tom was traveling for work, or I just physically could not drive another 45 minutes after a 10-hour day, Eunice would walk across that road. She'd sit with my father. She'd warm up whatever I'd left in the freezer. She'd watch Wheel of Fortune with him because he loved Wheel of Fortune, and she'd stay until I could get there. Sometimes past 9 at night, in a housecoat and a cardigan on a gravel road with no streetlights. She never asked for anything. Not once in 6 years. When I tried to give her money, just gas money, she wouldn't take it. She said, "Harlan sat with me the whole week after Dale died, every single night. I'm just paying back a debt, honey, that's all this is." Eunice passed away 8 months before my father did. At her funeral, my father sat in the front pew of the little Baptist church on Camp Creek Road and cried, openly, for the first time I'd seen since my mother's funeral. He said to me afterward in the car, "That woman gave me 6 more years with my family, Diane. Don't you ever forget that." I haven't. In 2020, my father did something I didn't find out about until much later. He went to see his attorney, the same attorney, Mr. Dale Ferguson, who had drawn up his will back in 2004, and he asked Mr. Ferguson to draft something called a memorandum of tangible personal property. It's a short document, perfectly legal under Tennessee law, that lets a person list specific items of personal property and who they want to go to, separately from the will itself, and it can be updated without redoing the whole will. My father signed it in front of a notary at the kitchen table. Mr. Ferguson kept the original in his file, attached to my father's will. On that memorandum, my father listed 11 items: the hospital bed, the generator, the chest freezer, the Kubota tractor, and a cedar chest that had belonged to my grandmother, my father's mother, which had sat at the foot of my parents' bed for 50 years, and which my mother had always told me, since I was a little girl, would be mine someday. Next to each item, my father had written one sentence in his own handwriting. "Diane bought this," or "Diane's mother promised her this." 11 items, 11 sentences. My father never told me he'd done this. I think, and I've had a long time to think about it, I think he did it quietly, the way he did most things, because he didn't want it to become a conversation. He didn't want a fight at the kitchen table while he was still alive to hear it. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, in the hospital bed I had bought him, in the den of the house he'd lived in for 53 years. I was holding his hand. Roy was not there, he told me later, on his way, though it took him until that evening to arrive, and by then it was over. I want to be honest. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about a folder. I wasn't thinking about a memorandum I didn't even know existed yet. I was just a daughter who had lost her father, sitting in a room that smelled like the lavender lotion I used on his hands every night, listening to a clock on the wall that he'd had since before I was born. It would be 3 weeks before any of the rest of it started. If you've ever been the one who showed up every day for years while someone else got credit for checking in, I want you to drop a comment and tell me how long it lasted for you. I read every one of them. Now, back to Camp Creek Road. 3 weeks after the funeral, Roy called me. He told me he'd been to see Mr. Ferguson, and that as the executor named in our father's will, which, I should explain, named Roy as executor, something my father had decided years earlier, back when Roy still lived close to the home place and I was raising small children 40 minutes away, and which none of us had ever revisited, Roy was going to handle everything. The house, the land, the contents. He said it would be easier on everybody if he just took care of it and split whatever came from selling things. I said that sounded fine. I want you to understand, at that point, I trusted him. Not because Roy had ever given me a reason to, exactly, but because he was my brother and our father had just died, and some part of me still believed that grief makes people better, not worse. That losing a parent might be the thing that finally leveled the table between us. It did not level the table, it tilted it further. Over the following 2 months, I learned, mostly secondhand, from Eunice's daughter, who still lived nearby, and from a woman at church who mentioned it to me at the grocery store like it was nothing, that Roy had been telling people a particular version of events. That he had been there for Dad at the end, when it counted. That I had kind of disappeared the last couple years, with her job and everything. That the house and the land were really his anyway, since he'd lived close by and helped out so much. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself it was grief talking. I told myself people say things at funerals, and in the months after that, they don't fully mean. Then, in late June, I got a call from Mr. Ferguson's office. A paralegal, very polite, informing me that the estate was moving toward closing, that the house and remaining land would likely be sold, and that, as a courtesy, they wanted to let me know that an estate auction was being scheduled for the contents of the house, per the executor's instructions. I asked if I could see a copy of the will. They sent it to me. I read it that night at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold. The will was simple, and it was old, drafted in 2004, before the hip, before the dementia, before any of the 6 years that followed. It named Roy as executor. It left the house and the 41 acres to be divided equally between Roy and me, with Roy given first right to buy out my half at appraised value if he chose to live there. And it left the contents of the home and all personal property therein to be divided as the executor sees fit, or sold, with proceeds split equally. Nothing in the will I was holding mentioned a memorandum. Nothing mentioned a cedar chest, or a tractor, or 11 handwritten sentences in my father's handwriting. I called Mr. Ferguson's office the next morning. I asked directly, was there ever an update to this will, anything filed after 2004? There was a pause, and then the paralegal said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. She said, "Let me check the file. Sometimes things get separated when a file's been pulled multiple times." She called me back 2 hours later. She had found it. A memorandum of tangible personal property, signed and notarized in 2020, attached to the original will, listing 11 items, and somehow, in the handling of the file over the past 2 months, it had not been included in what was sent to Roy, or to me, or referenced in the auction planning at all. I asked her to email me a copy immediately. She did. I printed it that night, and I sat at my kitchen table and I read my father's handwriting, "Diane bought this," 11 times, and for the first time since the funeral I cried. Not because of what it meant for the auction, because it meant he'd thought about it. He'd planned it. Quietly, the way he did everything, he had made sure that the truth would exist on paper, even if he never said it out loud. I called Mr. Ferguson the next day. I told him what I'd received. He confirmed it was authentic. His own office had drafted it and notarized it. He remembered the appointment. And he told me, somewhat apologetically, that he would notify Roy and amend the estate inventory accordingly. Here is what I decided, sitting at that kitchen table. I decided not to call Roy. I decided not to send him a copy. Not out of spite, I want to be clear about that, but because I had spent 6 years being the one who explained, who reminded, who clarified, who smoothed things over before they became fights. And I was tired. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 26 years of watching. Professionally, what happens when people don't keep their own records and assume someone else will sort it out for them? If Mr. Ferguson's office, with its trained staff and its filing systems, could lose a notarized legal document for 2 months, I wasn't going to assume anything would reach Roy the way it was supposed to. I had learned that lesson on Camp Creek Road a long time before I ever got my first claims file. So I did what I do. I made copies. I put the original memorandum in a fireproof box at my house. I took my shoebox of receipts, 81 of them, spanning 6 years, and I went through every single one, and I matched each item on my father's memorandum to its corresponding receipt, its corresponding canceled check, in some cases its corresponding photograph, because I'd photographed the hospital bed delivery and the tractor delivery for my own records, the way I photograph everything. I built a folder, a real one, a manila folder, tabbed in the order the items appeared on the memorandum. 11 tabs, 81 receipts behind them, organized by date. And then I waited, because the auction flyers were already up. Bright yellow, stapled to telephone poles from Greenville to Bayleton. Roy had listed the cedar chest as Lot 114. Before I tell you what happened at that auction, only 3% of people who watch actually subscribe. If this story is speaking to you, tap that button. Okay, let's finish this. The auction was held on the gravel lot beside the house, the same lot where I used to play as a kid, where my father parked the Kubota I'd bought him. 211 people, by the auctioneer's own estimate, walking the rows of folding tables, drinking coffee, picking up pieces of my father's life and turning them over in their hands. I want you to understand something about how I felt walking up that driveway that morning. I wasn't angry, not in the way you're picturing. I felt something closer to what I feel on the job, walking into a house after a fire. A kind of stillness. A kind of clarity. You're not there to feel things. You're there to document what's in front of you and make sure the record matches the truth. I had the folder under my arm. I found a spot near the front, close enough to hear the auctioneer clearly, and I waited. Lot after lot went by. Furniture, tools, a set of my mother's good dishes, sold for $11 to a woman I didn't recognize, and I let it go because the memorandum didn't cover dishes, and because some things you let go of even when it costs you something to watch. Then the auctioneer's assistant carried out the cedar chest and set it on the folding table. Lot 114. Beautiful piece, folks, solid cedar, dovetail joints. What am I bid? Somebody start me at $20. Do I hear 20? I raised my hand. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Buddy Cassillo who'd been running estate sales in Greene County for 30 years, pointed at me and said, 20? I've got 20. Do I hear? I'm not bidding, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I need you to stop the auction on this lot. I have a notarized legal document, a memorandum filed with my father's will that names this item as my property. I'd like to show it to you and to the family's attorney, who I believe is here today. The lot went quiet. Not silent. Somebody's truck was idling somewhere behind the crowd, but quiet in the way a room gets quiet when something unexpected happens and nobody's sure yet whether it's a problem or a show. Mr. Ferguson was there. He'd come, he told me later, partly out of respect for my father, and partly, he admitted with a small smile, because in 35 years of estate work, things had a way of getting interesting at auctions, and he liked to be present when they did. He walked over. I handed him the folder. He opened it, and I watched him read the first page, the memorandum, with my father's handwriting on it, and I watched his face change in the particular way a person's face changes when they recognize their own signature on a notary stamp. "This is the document I told your office about in June," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He turned to Buddy Cassilo and said, "Hold this lot. And I'd like to see the rest of today's lot list against this document, if you don't mind." That's when I saw Roy. He'd come around from the side of the house. He'd been talking to a man about a riding mower, lot 89, and he was walking toward us with the particular walk of a man who senses, before he understands, that something has gone wrong. "What's going on?" he said. Mr. Ferguson held up the folder. "Roy, this is a memorandum your father filed in 2020. It lists 11 items of personal property designated for Diane. It includes this cedar chest. It also includes the Kubota tractor, which I see is listed as lot 142 today, and the chest freezer, lot 76, and several other items." Roy looked at the folder, then he looked at me. I want to describe what happened on his face, because it's the moment everything in this story comes down to. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something closer to confusion, genuine confusion, the kind you can't fake, because faking it takes more thought than he had time for. He looked at that folder the way you look at a bill for something you don't remember buying. And then I saw the moment it landed. I saw him understand, really understand, for the first time that I had kept records. That for 6 years, while he'd been telling people I'd kind of disappeared, I had been writing things down. Dates, amounts, receipts. That somewhere in my house, there was a paper trail of every single thing he'd assumed nobody was watching. "You kept receipts," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "For 6 years," I said. "Yes." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Buddy Cassilo, to his credit, had already moved on to lot 115, a wheelbarrow, to keep the crowd from staring, though plenty of people were staring anyway. "Roy," Mr. Ferguson said, "I'm going to need to pull lot 76. 89 was already sold. That's a problem. And 114, 115, wait, 115's already gone, and 142. We'll need to sort out 89 separately. The rest of today can proceed." The rest of the auction did proceed. It took another 4 hours. I stood near the back for most of it because I didn't need to be at the front anymore. The folder had done what it needed to do. The riding mower, lot 89, which my father had also listed on the memorandum, a fact I hadn't even gotten to yet, had already sold for $350 to a man from Moshheim before anyone stopped the auction. That one took another 6 weeks to untangle. The man who'd bought it was decent about it once Mr. Ferguson explained the situation. He agreed to a refund once the estate reimbursed him, which it eventually did, out of Roy's share. But I want to talk about what happened 3 days later, because that's the part of this story that matters most to me, more than the cedar chest, more than the tractor, more than any of it. Roy called me. He asked if we could meet. Not at the house. He said he didn't want to go back out there for a while, but at the Waffle House off Highway 11E in Greenville, the one we used to go to as kids after church sometimes, when my father would let us get hot chocolate even though it wasn't on the kids' menu. I said yes. I got there first. I sat in a booth by the window and I watched Roy's truck pull in the same green canvas jacket, the same slow walk, except this time it wasn't confused. It was tired. He looked, sitting down across from me, older than I'd ever seen him look. 55, but tired in a way that ages a person past the number on their license. He didn't say much at first. We ordered coffee. The waitress knew him, everybody in Greenville knows everybody, and she said something about how sorry she was about Daddy, and Roy nodded and didn't say anything back. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. I'd learned, a long time ago, in rooms much harder than a Waffle House booth, that silence does more work than a response does when somebody's finally getting to something true. "I told people things," he said, "about you, about the last few years. I told myself it was true because," he stopped, started again. "Because if it was true, then I didn't have to feel bad about not being there. You know, if you'd kind of checked out, then me not showing up wasn't really anything. It was just, even." "It wasn't even," I said, quietly. Not as an accusation, just as a fact, the way you'd correct a number on a form. "No," he said. "I know that now. I think I knew it before, too. He looked out the window for a second. When that folder came out, Diane, the first thing I thought wasn't even about the chest or the tractor or any of it. The first thing I thought was she's been keeping track this whole time. Of everything. And I thought, God, what else does she have written down? About me, about all of it." "Just the 11 items," I said. "That's all. I didn't keep a folder on you, Roy. I kept a folder because that's what I do. It's my job. I document things. I had no idea Daddy had even made that memorandum until June." He nodded slowly. I think that surprised him more than anything, the idea that the folder wasn't a weapon I'd been holding in reserve. That it was just what 26 years of habit looks like, applied to a life instead of a claim. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the house, the land, all of it?" "That's between you, me, and Mr. Ferguson," I said. "But I'll tell you what I told him yesterday. I don't want to fight you for the house. I don't even know if I want my half of it. It's a lot of land, and Tom and I aren't moving to Greene County. What I want is for the 11 items on that memorandum to come to me, like Daddy wanted. The reimbursement for the riding mower and the freezer, since those already sold. And I want the estate accounting, all of it, to actually be accurate. Not because I think you stole anything on purpose, but because it needs to be right, for both of us. So that 10 years from now, neither one of us is still arguing about what happened in this Waffle House." Roy was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Eunice used to tell Dad you were the only one of us who ever read the fine print on anything." He almost smiled. "I used to think that was kind of a dig. Like, lighten up, Diane, I don't think that anymore." "It wasn't a dig," I said. "It was just true." We didn't hug. We didn't have some big movie moment in that booth. What we did was finish our coffee, and Roy paid for both of ours, first time in years he'd picked up a check for anything between us, and we walked out to the parking lot together, and he said, "I'd like to come to Thanksgiving this year. If that's still a thing. If you'll have me." "It's still a thing," I said. "You're welcome to come. I'd ask one thing, though." "What's that?" "No more stories," I said. About me or about Daddy or about who did what. If you've got something to say to me, say it to me. Not to the church, not to the cousins, not to whoever's standing next to you at the feed store. To me. He said, okay. And he meant it. I think he's kept it mostly in the year since. There have been a couple of slips, old habits dying the way old habits do, slowly and with relapses. But he's kept it mostly. If you're watching this and there's a folder in your life, somewhere you've been writing things down, not because you're planning a war, but because that's just who you are, I want you to drop a comment. Tell me what's in it. I read every one. The cedar chest is in my living room now. I had it refinished, gently, just enough to bring back the grain of the wood without losing the dovetail marks my grandfather made by hand 80 years ago. My daughter has already told me it's hers someday, and I've already started writing that down. The Kubota tractor sits in my own pole barn now, and Tom uses it on our 5 acres. The chest freezer is in our garage, and it's still full of the kind of meals I used to batch cook for my father. Habits don't disappear just because the reason for them does. I think about Eunice Tallant often. I think about the fact that the kindest, steadiest person in this entire story wasn't related to either one of us by blood, and that she never once asked for anything, and that the debt she said she was repaying was really just love, dressed up as an obligation, so that accepting it wouldn't feel like charity to my father. I planted a rose bush at her grave last spring. Pink one's her favorite. I go out and deadhead it every June. As for my brother, the door is open. I want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't. It means Thanksgiving. It means he's welcome at my table, and my kids know their uncle, and when he calls now, I answer. It doesn't mean I've forgotten how long it took or what it took to get here. It doesn't mean the next time something needs sorting out, and in families, there's always a next time that I'll assume it'll sort itself out without someone keeping the paper. I will always keep the paper. That's not a wound talking. That's just who I turned out to be, and I've made my peace with it. My father used to say, "We don't owe anybody anything, and that's worth more than money." I think about that sentence differently now than I did growing up. I used to think it was about pride. I don't think that anymore. I think it was about proof. About making sure that when the accounting finally happened, and it always happens, eventually, one way or another, nobody could say you took something that wasn't yours, and nobody could say you were owed something you couldn't show. He spent his whole life making sure his ledger was clean. And without ever telling me, in 11 sentences written in his own hand, he made sure mine would be too. Lessons from this story. 1. The people who keep quiet records aren't planning a fight. They're just used to nobody else keeping the record for them. 2. A family story repeated often enough starts to sound like fact, to everyone except the person it's about, who was there for all of it. 3. Grief doesn't automatically make people better. Sometimes it just removes the one person who was holding everyone to the same standard. 4. The kindness that cost someone something, a neighbor crossing a dark road night after night for nothing in return, is worth more than an inheritance, and it's the only kind that never needs settling. 5. You can open the door without pretending the last 6 years didn't happen. Forgiveness and memory aren't opposites. You're allowed to keep both. There's another story in the description. It starts with a phone call about a paternity test nobody asked for in a kitchen in Ohio on a Tuesday morning. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you then.